The Andy Pollin Show.
We got to go after this with everything we got, figuring they're going to come with everything they got.
I'll start off by saying I'm bored, I'm broke, and I'm back.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630 starts right now.
Bump in the road for the Commanders as they try to polish up the image post-Dan Snyder. We'll get to that story. Celtics are in the NBA Finals, and they got time to sit back and relax. And, of course, there's the death of Bill Walton to discuss. And Bill Walton passed away yesterday at the age of 71. He was someone who was so well admired as a player and even more so as a broadcaster and spurred so many great tributes that we really need like 5 hours to play all of them. But I tried to pull some of the best of what I saw and heard yesterday, and we'll play that throughout the show. That is the story that is most near and dear to my heart, maybe to yours. Maybe you're too young to remember Bill Walton as a player in college at UCLA and even in the NBA, where his career lasted into the 1986-87 season. That's as far as he went. Played 10 games with the Celtics before his body finally gave out. And when you look back on his life, there was reason that he might have felt cheated and somewhat bitter, because had he been healthy, he would have been considered one of the greatest to ever play the game. As it was, he's in the top 5 for sure for college basketball, and even playing 468 games, which is less than a third of the number of games that LeBron James has played in his NBA career. Bill Walton was still named one of the 50 greatest NBA players of all time when they celebrated the 50th anniversary of the league, and one of the 75 best when the league celebration took place recently for the 75th anniversary. That's how good he was. And there are some who had careers that were cut short by injury and feel cheated by that. I don't know if Gale Sayers was necessarily like that. I don't think Sandy Koufax was, but they were flashes. And while Koufax's career ended when he was 30 years old, and I think in the case of Gale Sayers, he was like 28, 27. Walton hung in there as long as he could, but missed a lot of seasons along the way. 2 full seasons in the prime of his career. In fact, between the ages of 25 and 30, which should be among your best years as an athlete, he played 14 games. That's all his body allowed him to do. And then to finish it the way he did as a sixth man of the Celtics, to which he loved. You know, he played 19 minutes a game. He averaged less than 10 points a game. But he was part of a winning organization. And even though he led the Portland Trail Blazers to the World Championship in 1977, was named MVP of the finals that year, it's being with the Boston Celtics at the end is what he identifies most with. And said, you know, when he went there, and he was running on fumes then, when he went there, he said, I thought the basketball would be good. I didn't know it would be this good. But there are so many things to talk about in his life. And I was thinking about this. I've reached an age now where, you know, my heroes are gone. They're dying. And you, if you're in my age bracket as well, in mid-60s, you're probably going to more funerals than you would, well, not that you would like, but I mean, that's a bigger part of your life than you would have expected at this point. And the people that you watched and admired so much are passing on. And in some cases, like in recent years, we lost Bobby Mitchell, who I was fortunate enough to know in his later years, really admired him, the first African-American player in the history of the Redskins, and just a really a fine man. I vaguely remember the last couple of years of his career with the Redskins. He retired before the 1969 season. In the case of Wes Unseld, who passed away, sure, I remember the years of the 70s when they went to the finals 3 or 4 times and were swept in 2 of them, and then lost to Seattle, but did win a championship along the way. I remember those years, but I don't really remember well when he first started with the Baltimore Bullets in 1968. And John Thompson, who I got to know as well after he had retired, or he didn't want to retire, but as he said, he resigned as coach at Georgetown. I don't really remember the early days of Georgetown. I remember the Patrick Ewing days and onward, like the early 80s, even the late 70s. I saw some of his teams. But Bill Walton was somebody I remembered from the start. And here's the thing that really hits me at my age, and if you're of similar age, you may feel the same thing. I always think of Bill Walton as the young counterculture guy. You know, he's the guy that grew the beard and grew his hair out at UCLA and then had his coach say to him, well, you have the right to grow your hair and grow your beard, but you're not going to play basketball here, and we'd like to have you. We're going to miss you, but, you know, rules are rules. Players have to get their hair cut. So he went out and got his hair cut. But he was arrested for protesting the Vietnam War. And when he got to the NBA with the Portland Trail Blazers, he had a look that I don't think anybody else in the league had at that time. He grew his hair long enough to go into a ponytail, and he grew out his beard, and he was hurt all the time. And, you know, there were people, and I'll get more into this, but the way he became known in the last 30 years was a lot different than the way he was known in the early years. He had a stutter, and he was very shy, and he was protected by John Wooden. There wasn't a lot of media availability in those days. It wasn't, you know, we didn't have social media for sure, and none of that. There was no sports center. There was no, like, 24-hour-a-day sports coverage. So there really weren't many opportunities to interview Bill Walton, and the ones that they asked for interviews, he almost always turned them down. And so we didn't know this guy, and we thought, oh, you know, this is not someone who fits into the mainstream of sports. Doesn't look like he loves basketball. He's hurt all the time and wants to do his own thing, wants to grow his hair long and grow out the beard. And then we saw in the metamorphosis that took place over the next 50 years of his life, in the end, he is celebrated as someone who celebrated life more than anybody else. But that wasn't the Bill Walton that I first got to observe back in the early 1970s when he burst on the scene at UCLA. So we'll get into that and some great commentary yesterday from Jay Billis on ESPN. Scott Van Pelt, who always knocks it out of the park with his writing, did one big thing on Bill Walton last night. We'll play that at 10 o'clock, and a lot to talk about with his life. But let me get to what's going on with the Commanders here. And boy, if there's one type of story they didn't want to have, it's this one. Brandon McManus, who was part of the big free agent haul of the offseason, signed after playing with the Jacksonville Jaguars, signed a pretty hefty contract. Kickers are making good money these days. One-year deal, $3.6 million. And saw his news conference when he was introduced. He seems to be an affable guy. Everything seems to be fine. And now this report yesterday that McManus is being sued by two flight attendants who say that while the Jaguars were on a flight to London last year, they spent 2 weeks playing games there, that there was a party that kind of broke out on the plane, and McManus is accused of rubbing himself against the two flight attendants and grinding against them. They are seeking $1 million in damages. This is a civil suit, not a criminal suit. But it's a civil suit looking for $1 million in damages from McManus and the Jaguars, and they want a jury trial with this. Now, obviously, after what we saw here during the Dan Snyder debacle and the later years and how it finally ended, the Commanders put out a statement, and we're right to say this. They say, earlier today we were made aware of the civil lawsuit filed on May 24th against Brandon McManus. We take allegations of this nature very seriously and are looking into the matter. We have been in communication with the league office and Brandon's representation, and we will reserve further comment at this time. His representation is Brett Galloway, his attorney, and he put out this statement. He said, these are absolutely fictitious and demonstrably false allegations made as part of a campaign to defame and disparage a talented and well-respected NFL player. We intend to aggressively defend Brandon's rights and integrity and clear his name by showing what these claims truly are, an extortion attempt. The Jaguars had a similar statement to the Commanders looking into the matter. They take it seriously. Yada, yada, yada. So what they are claiming, the two flight attendants, this flight that took place September 28th, that the flight quickly turned into a party as McManus and several other players disregarded flight attendants' personal space, air safety, travel, and federal law. The lawsuit also claims that McManus recruited 3 other flight attendants to the party, passed out $100 bills to encourage them to drink and dance inappropriately for him. I don't know how big this plane was. It just seems like, that there would be people on the plane and security people with, it's not just the team that's traveling to London. They take a big group with them. It would seem that somebody might have seen that. Maybe not. Maybe this took place in a secluded place, but it would seem that somebody would have said, whoa, we're crossing a line here. But this is not likely to be settled quickly. I don't think so. I mean, we're almost at June here, and training camp is supposed to open in late July. McManus is due at I don't know if he's been participating, I assume he has, participating in these off-season workouts, but they got a mandatory minicamp in a couple of weeks. I don't know how they handle this. And given that it's a kicker, they may not want to deal with this. And I read where it would be $1.5 million cap hit. They got cap space, and if they're convinced that there's something to this, this might be the time to cut bait. I'm not saying he's guilty in any way, and it may be, in fact, what his attorney says, an extortion attempt. It's just this organization at this time, with what they're trying to do, this is not something they can have hanging over them. This has been and it's been successful. Since the end of last season, they seemingly have done everything right and are getting all kinds of compliments for what they're doing, and people around the league are noticing and saying, hey, yeah, they have really made a change here. But when you have something like this for an organization that's trying to get away from this terrible image that they had, a well-deserved image, it appears, with Dan Snyder, it's a difficult thing for them to navigate. All right, to the game last night, and this one ended pretty much like 3 of the 4 in these Eastern Conference Finals. Close game at the end. Indiana makes a big mistake down the stretch, and the Celtics win a close game, which they did last night, 105-102. And it was a 3-pointer by Derek White with 43 seconds to go that proved to be the game winner. But even after that, they had 43 seconds to tie the game. They didn't handle it properly, a couple of turnovers, and Boston was able to run out the clock and sweep the series in 4 games. Afterwards, J.J. Redick and Doris Burke, who called the game along with Mike Breen, talked to Scott Van Pelt about the sweeping Game 4 and the entire series.
Well, turnovers for them at the end of the game were a huge problem in all these close games. But I just want to say this. For all this talk all season long about the Boston Celtics and their late-game offense and their late-game decision-making, 3 times in the Eastern Conference Finals, they get it done with big shot-making. Derek White tonight, Jaylen Brown. This has been thrilling for us to sit courtside and watch these games. Total team effort from the Boston Celtics. You can point to a number of plays in all 3 of these close games from a number of guys. They are a team.
Scott, can I follow there
Please.
a little bit? Just want to make a point about the 35-year-old head coach who's going to the NBA Finals. He took a timeout with about 3:38 left to go because Jason Tatum had picked up his 5th foul. So he lets him sit 1 defensive sequence, and Jason comes back in, gets a bucket, 3 rebounds, and a steal. And all season long, I've said a season ago, Mr. Mazzulla was thrown into a very tough situation and had to navigate it. And all season long, it feels different to me for him. It feels like he has managed this season.
Well, DB, what do they say in life? When somebody shows you who they are, you should believe it. I mean, Boston, this is who they've been. They've been the best team in the NBA all season. They've got superstars. They've got depth. And Indiana is new to this moment. I don't feel like the result is surprising at all. This was what was supposed to happen. But I just think the manner in which Indiana played so well for so long and then in the last moment sort of self-destructed, maybe that shouldn't be surprising either, particularly given who they were lacking in these last couple of games. Is that fair?
That's 100% fair. And I felt like the differentiator was the Celtics have been here before.
Sure.
There has been a collective experience. Drew Holiday is a former champion. He made big play after big play. The MVP vote it was 5-4, I believe, between Jaylen and probably Jason Tatum. either guy could have gotten it. There probably could have been some votes for Jrue Holiday had he had a bigger night tonight in terms of his scoring. But the strength of the collective has been what Boston is about, and I thought you saw that throughout this series.
JJ, the value of rest at this point, and we might very well see it be a lengthy layoff if Dallas is able to finish it off. I wonder, I get the rest that is so valuable, but at the same time, this is a game of rhythm, and you play every other day. Like, now they're going to sit. Now what happens?
Well, look, Boston has had other opportunities to rest during these playoffs. The week of the play-in game, they finished off the Heat. They had to wait a little bit for Cleveland to get through Orlando in 7 games. Joe Mazzulla's been here before. He's going to figure out ways to get them in competitive environments during this break. But I actually think this rest is great for this team right now. Joe Mazzulla said this isn't a bench series. This is a starter series. He relied heavily on his starters. Al Horford playing a ton of minutes. You would assume Kristaps Porzingis has enough time now to ramp up and get ready for Game 1 of the NBA Finals.
Yeah, 10 more days for Kristaps Porzingis to get ready to play is beneficial. But I am more in line with what Scott is saying about the long layoff. It's going to be 10 days for the Celtics before they start the finals. They start the finals at home a week from Thursday. Could be 9 days for the Dallas Mavericks if they take care of business tonight against Minnesota. That's going to be 2 stale teams, because he's right. There's a rhythm that goes along with an NBA season. Yeah, you have an all-star break, which lasts a week, but that's regular season. You got to be firing at all cylinders when you get to the NBA Finals. And I just wonder what these teams are going to look like and what the NBA is thinking, that they're going to be out of sight, out of mind for a week and a half if Dallas wins tonight. Now, maybe Minnesota comes back and extends it to 6 games or something like that. But it just seems like, here we're going to have another sports weekend where there's nothing else but baseball. There is the hockey. But in terms of the television numbers, it's, like 10-1. You would seem like you'd want to be there, but that's not going to be the case. They wait until a week from Thursday, and the Boston Celtics get started against likely the Dallas Mavericks, unless there's an historic comeback by Minnesota. No team has ever come back from 3-0, and they play Game 4 tonight. I want to hit the lacrosse real quick here. I have high hopes for Maryland, but realistically, this was a season that was not a typical Maryland season. They didn't play all that well, especially at the end of the year. They were going into the playoffs, not the playoffs, but the tournament with 6 losses, or 5 losses. 5 losses. But they were scrappy. They came from behind in at least one of the tournament games, and then they beat a Virginia team which looked really strong, and they had beaten Maryland earlier this year. They beat them on Saturday, but they got to the defending champs, and the defending champs were just too much. Maryland scored the first 2 goals against Notre Dame, and then Notre Dame scored 10 of the next 11, and that was the ball game. 15-5 was the final. John Tillman, who I think will go down as the greatest lacrosse coach in Maryland history. He's been there since 2011. This was his 8th time taking his team to the final. He's won 2 championships and said this about the loss.
Credit to Notre Dame. They're an awesome team. That's why I like, having done this for a long time, listen, I wish we had won. And we did everything we could to prepare to win. But we would have had to play incredibly clean and really, really high level to win this game. Just because I watch enough film and I know what they've done over the course of the year, and they've been doing it to a lot of people.
And they did it to Maryland yesterday. Again, really no contest there. And a little surprised about the announced attendance in Philadelphia, 31,479. Lacrosse has reached a level where if you're not selling out, you should be coming close. And Philadelphia is a great spot to have it in because it's in a real hot lacrosse area, the seaboard between like New York and down to I guess parts of Virginia, and it's become more nationwide too. I mean, Denver was in the Final Four again, but I would expect a bigger crowd, especially a short trip for the Maryland people, and they're the Notre Dame subway alumni. They're everywhere. But Notre Dame wins back-to-back. They have 2 great players. They're brothers, Pat and Chris Kavanaugh. And I'm reminded of when I really first started to get to be really aware of lacrosse and really, kind of get into it. My wife's really into it. My kids are into it. They went to Wooten High School, which had great lacrosse when they were there. But I remember covering the 1990 championship game, which was played at Rutgers. So Rutgers, at that time, I don't think they sat 30,000, maybe expanded the stadium. But they played at Rutgers, and they were playing Loyola of Maryland, and it was Syracuse with the Gate brothers. Now, they later had to vacate that because they were getting paid under the table. But the Gate brothers were the first great brother duo that I can remember. And I think Gary Gate goes down as one of the greatest lacrosse players in history. And Syracuse was dominant in winning that championship. All right, coming up, much more on the life and times of Bill Walton. Tony and Mike weighing in last night on PTI. And Walton later this hour with the story of how he took the whole team to see the Grateful Dead in that wonderful year that he had with the Boston Celtics. We'll talk about that and more as we continue. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
Tony's coming up at 11 o'clock today, and I would think he'll have Mike Wilbon on today, and I would imagine they will do a much longer version of what they talked about to start off PTI last night. It did not have the traditional beginning of the show where they have like kind of a joke, a back and forth. This opened similar to when Kobe Bryant died. They do this when there are more somber stories to deal with, and the death of Bill Walton yesterday was certainly one of them. And so they talked about his career, obviously, where he was the 3-time Player of the Year in college basketball, won 2 national championships at UCLA, won a pair of titles in the NBA in very different ways as the star player of the Trailblazers in 1977 and as a sixth man in 1986 with the Boston Celtics and everything in between, the injuries, the broadcasting, the whole thing. But they also gave you a couple of personal stories here about their own interactions with Bill Walton. In the case of Tony, going back to when he was a young sports writer covering those UCLA teams for, I think it was Newsday or may have been the New York Times. But this is their recollections of Bill Walton yesterday as they kicked off PTI.
I worked with Bill in Bristol. He would fly to Bristol. He started his television career, part of it, at ESPN. And he was in such pain, his feet and back, he would have to lay on the floor during the commercial break sometimes or between shows because he was in such pain. But yet, he was the guy in the room after being a severe stutterer and being so withdrawn as a young person to be as outgoing as he was. And so it's just, I'm incredibly sad today because Bill Walton has been at all the parts of basketball, watching it, the game, consuming it, the broadcast that I've ever experienced. And I loved him, and I know you did too.
Well, unlike you, I covered him in college. I was in St. Louis in 1973 when he shot 21 for 22 against Memphis State and won the national championship. I think he had like 44 points and 13 rebounds. The next year, I was in Greensboro, North Carolina, when David Thompson beat Bill Walton and UCLA in the semifinals, and they went on to win the national championship. I covered him when he was in the NBA early in Portland. I was in Philadelphia when Portland beat the 76ers for the NBA title, and I was in the room when our friend Brent Musburger held up a microphone in front of Bill Walton and began his question with the following words: big guy, big guy, big guy, big guy, big guy. Okay, now Walton was very difficult to deal with in UCLA and in his early years in the NBA for the press. Okay, John Wooden sheltered him. John Wooden didn't force him to talk to anybody, and Bill didn't want to talk. He was rather mysterious. So as you can imagine, for me, Mike, at my age, it was with amazement that I looked at Bill Walton as a broadcaster and how outgoing he was and how bombastic he was, how talkative he was, how funny he was. And in later years, I would stand with him and say, well, what happened when you were a kid and I was a kid and you never talked to anybody? And in terms of playing, if you didn't see him when he was healthy, you won't understand what I'm saying. He was a great and dominant player, so much so that a basketball league, the ABA, offered to put a franchise in his hometown and stock it with UCLA players if he would sign with them in the early 70s. And that didn't happen. I'll just say this. The two greatest college players ever are Bill Walton and Kareem. Ever. That's it. That's the list. We have reached the point.
Let me mention this to you real quickly, Tony. When I was inducted, fortunately for me, gratefully, into the Basketball Hall of Fame a couple of years ago, I'm rehearsing my speech, and Bill Walton ducks his head in the room, and you're supposed to have 5 minutes for the speech. And he says, "You go longer than 5 minutes, I'm giving you my blessing. There's no bell. Tony's not here. He can't stop you. You go until they drag you off the stage." And of course, I laughed until I was almost in tears that Bill Walton, who ducked his head into everybody's life, everybody's got a story, a great one about Bill Walton.
And Bill Walton has some great stories to tell as well. We will get to those, actually including this one. And I'm going to spend some more time at 10 o'clock talking about how Maryland got, in 1970, the #1 recruit in the country in Tom McMillan. The best basketball player in that class was Bill Walton, but there really was no recruiting battle whatsoever. Times were different. You didn't have the attention that you have now, where a great player is identified when he's like 12 or 13 years old. Bill Walton was playing at Helix High in San Diego. He was a great player there, and schools noticed him, but you didn't hear anything about a big recruiting war for Bill Walton. Well, there really wasn't going to be a need for one, because as Walton told Dan Patrick, and this, I believe, was the last time he was on the Patrick Show about a year and a half ago, he said that he fell in love with UCLA in 1965 when he went to a friend's house. His family, it's really interesting, his family did not have a television set. His father didn't believe in it. His father was not interested in athletics at all, was interested in music. His mother was a librarian, and she encouraged him to read, which he did, because he wasn't watching television. But he went to a friend's house, and this was probably even syndication then, because they didn't televise nationally the Final Four. Networks didn't pick it up. But they televised UCLA with Gail Goodrich winning the national title in 1965, when I believe it was played like on a Saturday afternoon. And that's when Walton said to himself, that's where I want to go. That's who I want to play for, John Wooden. That's the school I want to go to. He was from San Diego, so not far away, but he wanted to go to UCLA. So in talking about a year and a half ago with Dan about the recruiting wars and the NIL and all that goes on in college basketball these days, that wasn't going to be the case when Walton was coming out of high school in 1970.
If you didn't go to UCLA, where were you going?
UCLA.
There was no second choice.
No second choice. And I'm reading a brilliant book right now. I know you're a reader and you love books and knowledge and everything. One of my teammates, the winningest player in the history of college basketball, Larry Farmer, got a brand new book out, Santa Monica Press. It's called The Role of a Lifetime. And Larry's experience was totally different than mine. And although in many ways it was totally similar, because we played for the same coach. He was the starter for 2 years on our first two championships there, undefeated, never lost a game with Larry in the starting lineup there. And he played with Sidney Wicks in his sophomore year, an era of 3 years of college basketball. And it's just a beautiful read. And it's a fun, upbeat, happy book. And all the different things that went down, and the way that Larry's able to turn the phrase to make it so real, so inviting, so enveloping, which was what UCLA was all about. And so many spectacular people. And yes, we had John Wooden, as great a coach as there's ever been, but we also had J.D. Morgan, as great an athletic director as there's ever been. We had Chancellor Young, who was the chancellor at UCLA for 29 years. I mean, that's a job that just chews people up and spits them out in public education. And then we had Ducky Drake. Ducky Drake got there in 1923 and he died in 1988. And I can't even do the math anymore. I think that's 65 years. But he was the trainer. He was the track coach. He was Rayford Johnson and C.K. Yang's coach. But he was the conduit that understood young people's problems and was able to be the sounding board and be the buffer between Chancellor Young, J.D. Morgan, John Wooden, and all the players. It was a phenomenal experience for me. I wish it had lasted forever.
What would you have made with name, image, and likeness at UCLA?
I was doing a show one time with Kareem. and we got to the Q&A, and they asked Kareem, and we always defer to Kareem, the greatest player I ever played against, the standard of excellence. And so we'll get to Kareem and his records and LeBron in a moment. But we're sitting there, and it goes to the Q&A, and they said, Kareem, if you had played in the era of NIL, what would you have made? And he looked at me, and he looked back at the crowd, and he said, Europe. And then he looked over at me and he said, and Bill would have got South America.
Yeah, so he could tell stories, and he told them well. And also, I played all of that because it illustrates, his generosity. He's talking about Ducky Drake. People don't know Ducky Drake from UCLA. They know Bill Walton. They know John Wooden. They know the dynasty teams with Lou Alcindor, later Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. But that's kind of who he was. He was interested in everybody and their families and remembered names and birthdays. And I mean, just, really an incredible person who started out with an entirely different image, which I will get to. And then you look at the stardom that he had at UCLA, the stardom that he had with the Portland Trailblazers before injuries got the best of him, and then he finishes his career doing what he loved the best of his entire basketball career. I guess the UCLA days were the best, but from the NBA, he was a 19-minute-a-game guy. He's coming off the bench for the Boston Celtics with the greatest front line in history, Robert Parrish, Kevin McHale, and, of course, Larry Bird. And he loved that, and in fact, he was so deferential when he came to the Celtics, he called Robert Parrish to say, are you okay with this? I'm not coming here to take your job. I'm just here to help you win. And Parrish said he didn't have to do that. He was Bill Walton, But that's kind of who he was. And this is a story that he loved to tell about his days with the Celtics, and he tells it to Dan Patrick, but it involves Bill Walton sitting on the bench. And this is the story he tells about Larry Bird.
We're playing in the Boston Garden, and I'm not really playing. I'm sitting on the bench cheering for Larry and Kevin and Chief and DJ and Danny. And Larry's having a monster game. And the Boston Garden is just rocking. It's against the Knicks, and Hubie Brown is coaching, and Patrick Ewing and Bernard King and all these guys, right? An excellent team, but certainly not the Boston Celtics with Larry Bird and Robert Parrish and Kevin McHale and DJ and Danny and the second string that we had. And the crowd is going crazy. Larry, MVP. I mean, the scoreboard is shaking, right? And Hubie, who was the coach of the Knicks at the time. Now, Hubie, as the broadcaster at 89, and really ever since he became the broadcaster, has been the model of decorum. Right? But when he was the coach, I mean, he was a firebrand over there, and he loved to yell at his own players. And when that didn't work, he started yelling at us, the other team. And so Larry's making three after three, and the ball rolls out of bounds right to Hubie Brown, who picks up the ball, and normally you just throw it back to the ref. And Larry comes running over there because he doesn't want the game to stop, right? And Hubie won't give Larry the ball, right? And Larry's like trying to grab it, and the ref comes over, what's going on here? And the crowd is just stunned and everything. And finally, Larry, does get a hold of the ball, but Hubie still won't give it up. The referee comes in, separates them, and Hubie looks at Larry and says, oh, yeah, Bird, yeah. You think you're so good making all these threes and firing this crowd up here and torching the Knicks here on a Friday night in the Boston Garden. You think you're so good, Bird, making all these threes? Let's see you bank one of those threes in. And Larry looked at like Al Pacino from Taxi Driver. I hope I got Al and Robert De Niro.
De Niro.
Which one was it?
Yeah, De Niro.
Oh, De Niro. Okay, It was Robert De Niro for Taxi. And Larry looks at Hubie like he's the taxi driver, right? He says, you're talking to me? And Larry who was already so on fire, he grabs the ball from the ref, throws it in, gets it right back, right in front of Hubie, like a foot from the sideline where the coaches stand, right? Looks at Hubie and banks in a three. And then he spends the rest of the game banking in every three. Every time you just glare over at Hubie, you're looking at me, you talking to me. Oh, my God.
Yeah, that's Bill Walton. And he was maybe at his best telling stories about other people. He had so many rich stories himself. And when he would talk about himself, he would talk about failure. And they famously lost a game to Notre Dame. Probably Tony will talk about this today because he covered this. And it was Digger Phelps and Notre Dame, and Digger Phelps was a big showman. And Tony tells the story of Digger before the game looking at the camera angles so they can get the best shot of him when he knocks off UCLA. During the week, he had his team practice cutting down the nets, to get them ready for this big upset. And Walton, who at that point had not lost, he may have lost games earlier in his high school career, but he played on an undefeated state championship his senior year at Helix High. He went to UCLA. In those days, freshmen were ineligible to play varsity, but they had a junior varsity team. They went 22-0. He goes undefeated as a sophomore, and they win the national championship. He goes undefeated as a junior, and they win the national championship with his historic performance as he hits 21 of 22, finishes with 44 points and 13 rebounds. And then he plays his senior year, and he's looking to complete what would be a fifth straight undefeated season. Didn't lose at all as a senior in high school, didn't lose as a freshman, didn't lose as a sophomore or junior on varsity. And then UCLA stops the 88-game win streak. Until he died, Walton could tell you the exact number of days that had passed since the streak was stopped. He was so intent on finishing his career perfectly at UCLA with 3 undefeated years, and they lost that game. They lost 2 games late in the season, and this is covered in the documentary Luckiest Guy in the World, which ESPN put out about a year ago, and boy, I'm glad they did. They really did a great job of covering his life. But there were some cracks there, and there were some signs that, the new age athlete was starting to get to John Wooden, and he wasn't handling it as well as he should have, and the players weren't. And they lost back-to-back games in a weekend at Oregon and Oregon State. So they went into the NCAA tournament with 3 losses. They played NC State, which had gone undefeated the year before, but was ineligible to play in the NCAA tournament because they had engaged in illegal recruiting with David Thompson. But then in the Final Four, they knocked off UCLA in double overtime, and then it ended Walton's career. But he looks at it like, hey, if we beat Notre Dame and we finish out the regular season undefeated, we roll through the NCAA tournament, and I finish with a perfect record. And with all his success, 3-time player of the year, going on to success in the NBA, that's what hurt him the most, was losing that game to Digger Phelps and Notre Dame. And they became friends because, that's kind of the way that Walton was. He enjoyed so much of life, he wasn't going to be walking around bitter about losing a college basketball game during his senior year. Coming up, Walton on his other great love besides basketball, and that was the Grateful Dead and how he shared it with his teammates in that magical year in Boston, 1985-1986. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630.
The Andy Pollin Show on ESPN 630, the sports capital.
Louis Riddick did a podcast with John Keim earlier this week with thoughts on what the Commanders have done in the offseason. Now, there is the Brandon McManus story, which we've talked about a little bit already, which is hanging over them like a bit of a cloud right now as he is facing a civil suit from 2 flight attendants who say he sexually assaulted them on a flight to London last year when he was playing with the Jaguars. But otherwise, this offseason has gone swimmingly for them in terms of what they've done in player acquisition, development, and so forth, and the staff and all that. So Louis Riddick will discuss that. We'll get to some of what he said coming up in the 10 o'clock hour. We're spending a lot of time on Bill Walton, passed away yesterday at the age of 71, and the career that he had on the court and off the court is almost beyond belief that somebody could be this type of person who had so many different facets to his life and was just beloved by everybody at the end. Not very much for basketball, because really his last time being effective as a player was 1986. So what are we talking about here? We're talking 38 years ago. That's a long time. That's generations of people who never saw him play, but they remember him in the tie-dye T-shirts and the polo shirts and the wacky stuff he did with Dave Pash doing Big 12 games and all the other broadcasting that he did. He was just, a force of nature away from the court. And his great love, besides basketball, was the Grateful Dead. And at 7 feet, and he didn't want to be known as a 7-footer. He went out of his way to tell people, no, I'm 6'11". Well, you could look at him against other centers. You could say, yeah, he's over 7 feet tall. But he saw that as kind of like a stigma. Oh, he's a 7-footer. So he didn't want to be known as a 7-footer. So he was 6'11". Whatever he was literally and figuratively the Grateful Dead's biggest fan. And so when he got to Boston, he was, in his mid-30s at that point, 33 years old. And he had younger teammates. Bird at that point was still in his mid-20s, maybe late 20s. I guess he was in the late 20s at that point. But they looked at him as kind of an older guy. They had watched him play in college. And they also knew about his fascination with the Grateful Dead. And the Grateful Dead come to Boston. And the teammates recognized this. And as Walton later said, they came to him with desires to engage in his great pleasure.
They came over and said, what's going on, Bill? I said, what do you mean what's going on? We're just getting ready for practice. And they said, no, Bill, something's happening here in Boston because there's all kinds of people with tie-dye T-shirts on. They all got long hair and they smell funny. What's happening here? I said, well, the Grateful Dead are coming to town. They said, really? Grateful Dead? Jerry Garcia, they're going to play in Boston? Do you know those guys, Bill? I said, yeah. And I know them. I'm going to go to the concert too. And they said, well, do you think we could go too, Bill? I said, let me check it out. And so I go out and I asked Ramrod and Big Steve and Robbie Taylor and all the guys if it would be all right if some of the Celtics would come. And they said, sure, no problem. But I had to explain to everybody in the Grateful Dead that this was, in Boston, and the Celtics were just icons. And they couldn't really go out in public because they were so popular. So they said, we'll take care of this, Bill. And so they built this special little enclave right on the side of the stage where, unless you were on the stage, you couldn't look into this little area. It was all curtained off and everything. Just a perfect little place to watch the concert. And everybody that night met at Larry Bird's house. Everybody, that is, with the exception of Danny Ainge, his wife, wouldn't let him go. And so here we were at Larry's house. We met at Larry's house. And he arranged for this incredible fleet of limousines for us to all go to the concert together. And so we get there, and I'm introducing all the guys backstage. Jerry, here's Larry, Kevin, here's Bob Weir and Phil and Robert Parrish and Dennis Johnson, literally everybody just going around. And then Cameron comes up, Cameron and Robbie, they come up and they say, okay, it's time to start the show. Let's go, you guys. And so they take us up on the stage first, and the lights are all dark, so you can't see anything. And we sort of sneak around and we go in the back, and then they bring these coolers full of our favorite drinks, milk and water and 7-Up, and put them right in front of us. And then the Grateful Dead come up on the stage, and the crowd just goes nuts. It's the most electric atmosphere, and everybody jumping up and down, the anticipation, the excitement. What could be better? And these guys on the Celtics had never seen a Dead show before. I mean, hundreds of shows for me. And so while the band is warming up and taking the last few notes, the excitement is just so palpable. Your skin is just goosebumps, electric as can be. Jerry Garcia, he steps forward into that little shaft of light, right where his microphone is, just to make sure everything is perfect, making sure his foot pedals are all there. And then he looks over into the enclave, and he makes eye contact with Larry Bird. And he looks at him, gives him a nod, a little wink, and he says to him, he says to him, Larry, this is what we do. And then he turned back to the audience and just blew it out. 5-6 hours. Unbelievable. The crowd just absolutely on fire. The show's over. The band races off the stage. They got to get to the next show. The lights come on. Everybody is just wild-eyed as can be. It's so charged up. And the guys on the Celtics, they look at me and they say, wow. Oh my gosh, can we come back tomorrow? And they've been going ever since.
he sounds like he's a school kid, showing he knows somebody famous. I mean, that's amazing. That's really a great story. And last night, before the Pacers were eliminated by the Celtics, Indiana coach Rick Carlisle, who was part of that group, and then stayed with the Celtics the next year. The next year was Walton's last year in the NBA. He played only 10 games for the Celtics that season because the injuries just were too much at that point. But Carlisle tells the story of wanting to go to a Grateful Dead concert at the old Capitol Center, 1987. And he calls Walton, and he's met a girl, and I think it's their first date. And he says, hey, I'd like to take her to the Grateful Dead at the Capitol Center. Can you get me in? And Walton says, no problem, tells him to ask for some guy at the loading dock. And he goes, you sure? Yes, it's taken care of. So Carlisle doesn't really know for sure, and he's on a first date. So if this goes bad, this is going to be a problem. But he goes to the loading dock. Now, you remember the old Capitol Center, there was no underneath. Like, everything was above ground. It's not like the arenas today, like where you park underground if you go to Capital One Arena. This was all above ground. The players parked in the parking lot outside. You see them going to their cars after the game. So he was actually able to drive up to the loading dock. And he asked for the person that Walton told him to ask for. And sure enough, he produced 2 passes, and they were, all access passes to the Grateful Dead. And he takes his date, who's now his wife, going back to 87, takes his date backstage, and they watch the concert. And maybe that was what clinched it for him, as I guess they've been married a long time, right? This is 1987 that he's talking about. A couple of baseball things. We'll spend some more time on Bill Walton in the next hour. Angel Hernandez, the embattled umpire, has retired effective immediately. Now, he's been on the job since 1991, but he's only 62 years old. That's not that old, it seems to be, for an umpire. It sounds like, and especially when you got a guy who's retiring in late May, it sounds like he was pushed out. Worked his last game May 9th, was replaced on Lance Barkdale's crew by Jacob Metz. He had sued Major League Baseball in 2017, alleging the league had engaged in racial discrimination. The lawsuit was thrown out by a district court judge, and it was held up by an appeals court last year. But you say the name Angel Hernandez, and people in baseball go, oh, yeah, that's a mess. During a 2018 playoff game, he had 3 calls reversed by replays in the first 4 innings. This season, he called 3 strikes on pitches that were well off the plate, from Houston's J.P. France to Texas's Wyatt Langford. In 2022, Philadelphia DH Kyle Schwarber was ejected by Hernandez after he slammed his bat following a called strike on a Josh Hader fastball that was off the plate. And then, going back, and he's suffering from ALS now, can no longer speak. But Steve McMichael from the Bears was once ejected from Wrigley Field after criticizing Hernandez over the loudspeaker during the 7th inning stretch. He has not worked a World Series since 2005, last umpired a championship series in 2016. Blamed Joe Torre, who was in charge of umpiring later in declaration, Hernandez said, had an overly confrontational style. And that was the reason that he didn't want him to be doing games. So Angel Hernandez is out as an umpire. He retired voluntarily or pushed. They won't have him to criticize anymore. All right, much more on Bill Walton still to come, what Louis Riddick says about the offseason for the Commanders, and a whole lot more. It's the Andy Pollin Show, ESPN 630. All right, we just got word that Tony's feeling a little bit under the weather today, so at 11 o'clock, Mike Callow will sit in for Tony. In the meantime, lots more to talk about in life and times of Bill Walton, who passed away yesterday at the age of 71. I'll have some great stuff from Scott Van Pelt last night on SportsCenter. And Jay Billis was just phenomenal yesterday. Minutes after the news was announced, they were in a weather delay for the lacrosse championship between Maryland and Notre Dame. So SportsCenter was on, and Matt Barry was anchoring the coverage, and they got Jay Billis on. And I have followed Jay since he was playing at Duke. Remember interviewing him during the Final Four there in 1986, and throughout his great broadcasting career at ESPN, have had him on as a guest a number of times, and has always admired his work. I've never heard him emotional and he was really emotional in discussing the death of Bill Walton because he had a connection there that is different than just a colleague relationship. Fortunately for me and all of us, Sonny Jurgensen is still alive. But on a lower level, I had something of a connection with him growing up in Washington, rooting for him. And he would be, I guess, a sports idol for me. And then having the opportunity to work with him in radio over the years at 980, that was a great thrill. And getting to know him, I mean, I don't know him well, but, know him well enough to have conversations and, we can kind of kid each other a little bit. I mean, that's an incredible thing. And Bill has had kind of the same thing. He grew up in Los Angeles. He was probably in middle school when Walton finished up at UCLA. I think they were like, whatever it was, like I think Jay finished high school in 82 and Walton finished college in 74, so whatever the math is there. But probably one of his early sports memories was watching those great UCLA teams, and that was one of his idols. Well, they worked together extensively at ESPN in later years, and that is a connection that some of us, that type, some of us have been lucky enough to make, and he made that with Bill Walton. He's got some wonderful stories to tell, which we will get to later this hour. Let me just give you my personal look at this and how I was consuming, I guess, the career of Bill Walton. Now, remember, in 1970, there weren't high school basketball players on the radar. It was very, very rare if that was the case. And one of those rare cases was Tom McMillan, who was only the second high school player to appear on the cover of Sports Illustrated when appearing on the cover of SI was everything. And several years earlier, Rick Mount, who was a great player at Indiana High School, and went to Purdue and had a great career there, he was on the cover of SI. In I guess it would have been 69 or maybe 70, there was Tom McMillan on the cover from Mansfield High in Pennsylvania. And initially, he was going to go to North Carolina. Dean Smith got another one. But at the last minute, he changed his mind, in part because his father had been ill, and he wanted his father to not have to travel as far to see him play. Pennsylvania to College Park was a shorter trip than going down to Chapel Hill. So he went to Maryland, where his brother had gone, and was part of the incredible Lefty Driesell recruiting class of that year, which also included Len Elmore. And they were often running towards becoming what would be known as the UCLA of the East. They didn't quite get there, but they tie in pretty amazingly. So while all this recruiting is going on for Tom McMillan, and I guess there's a big, to-do about Lefty and Dean, who are, lifetime rivals, that Lefty got his, and now, look out, ACC, here comes Maryland. Somewhat quietly, Walton is lighting it up at Helix High. And Denny Crum, who later became a great coach, won a couple of national titles at Louisville, was John Wooden's top assistant at UCLA. And he said, you need to come see this kid play. Now, in those days, the Wizard of Westwood, it wasn't, he's like, Muhammad doesn't come to the mountain comes to Muhammad. And he didn't go on recruiting trips. Lou Alcindor, the first time he met John Wooden was when he showed up at UCLA. I mean, he was known as a great player in high school. Everybody wanted him, but he wanted to go to UCLA. He went there, and that was it. They didn't have to sit and watch his high school games. That's where Alcindor wanted to go. He went to UCLA. Same thing with Walton, pretty much, although, there were schools that were trying to get him, but he knew he wanted to play for UCLA. And Denny Crum got Wooden to say, yeah, it looks like he's good enough to play for us. So he commits there and goes, and, he's not on the radar because freshmen are ineligible to play in the 70-71 season. Meantime, we're watching McMillan and Elmore play for a great Maryland freshman team. And then 1971, he becomes eligible to play varsity, and people begin to notice, and they have an undefeated season, and they beat Florida State for the championship. But those days, the Final Four was not that big a deal, and I'm not even sure it was network television. It may have been, but it in many cases, years before, it was syndicated. And so after this 1971-72 championship, the networks start to notice, and they think, this is really getting to be interesting. And it almost becomes the Caitlin Clark effect. Like, this UCLA team with Walton as a sophomore has just won its 6th consecutive national championship. The Celtics had that kind of run a little bit earlier, but now it was UCLA's chance to be this dynasty. 6 straight titles. So NBC made the decision to put the game on a Monday night. Monday night had become a big night for sports several years earlier with the advent of Monday Night Football. So now they're going to play the national championship game against Memphis State on a Monday night on NBC. And you talk about the perfect storm. 6-time defending national champion, undefeated team. Bill Walton, who was, for all intents and purposes, Caitlin Clark to the women's game of that day. And he delivers a performance for the ages. 21 of 22, 13 rebounds, 44 points, considered to be one of the greatest college performances ever. And that was a rocket booster for college basketball. And he was such an incredible force in college sports that this was the height of the ABA-NBA wars, that the ABA came to him after that season and said, I know you're not eligible to go to the NBA. They weren't taking underclassmen then. But you come to the ABA and give up your senior year, we'll put a team in San Diego, your hometown, and we'll stock it with UCLA players, and we'll give you all the money you want. You want to be part owner, you can have it. I mean, you're the biggest thing in basketball right now, and we need you in our war with the NBA. He said, no, you don't offer me anything that's better than what I got at UCLA. So he comes back for his senior year, and to open the 1973-74 season, it's December 1st. Now they get started in early November. But in those days, it was usually like around Thanksgiving weekend. So December 1st, 1971, Lefty Driesell, whose ambition is to make Maryland the UCLA of the East, is going to take a giant step towards that as they schedule UCLA at Pauley Pavilion. And it's Bill Walton as a senior, Tom McMillan as a senior, Len Elmore as a senior. And if you beat UCLA, you are the top dog. In the opening game of the season, you become the number 1 team in the country because you just knocked off number 1, a team that hadn't lost in like 3 years. And Maryland played a great game. UCLA did not. They did not shoot well. And actually, Len Elmore outscored Walton. I think it was 19-18, similar in rebounds. Like each of them had 14 or 15 rebounds apiece. But Maryland had a chance to win the game. McMillan missed a shot or had a shot blocked at the end, and UCLA hit a shot right after the buzzer. And Lefty went running up to the table to make sure that bucket didn't count because it was important to him if they were going to lose, it was only going to be by 1. And they lost that game 65-64. And had it been today, you would say, well, we will definitely see these teams down the road, probably in the Final Four. And in those days, there was only one conference that had a postseason tournament, and that was the ACC. And you had to win the postseason tournament to get into the NCAA championship, to get into the tournament. And so, as you know, historically, they played that incredible game, lost in overtime to NC State. UCLA back again, even though they lost 3 games that year. They lost to Notre Dame, and they lost 2 games late in the season to conference opponents, Oregon and Oregon State. They went back, and they played in the Final Four, NC State, and lost in double overtime. And NC State went on to beat Marquette for the national title. And Maryland did not have a chance to play. And what we thought would be the culmination of the UCLA of the East when we would get that rematch in the NCAA tournament between Maryland and UCLA didn't happen. But from that game of 1972, it's a very memorable cover, and Len Elmore celebrates it to this day. He's gone up to try to block Walton's shot. I don't know if the shot went in, but that's the cover of SI. A Maryland player on the cover of Sports Illustrated along with the great Bill Walton. And that's, part of how they all tie together that period of time. Now, in that time, Walton is seen as a rebel. He was arrested protesting the Vietnam War, and he also famously spent the offseason after winning that national championship and Player of the Year and historic performance, and the ABA is throwing suitcases full of money at him. He decides he's going to be his own guy now. And, okay, the program that was built by John Wooden is built on a foundation of teamwork, and everybody on the team is treated the same. And Walton says, nah, I'm going to be an individual. I'm going to grow a beard, which he did in the offseason, and grow my hair out. And I'm going to show up for practice, and I'm going to tell John Wooden this is the way it is. Well, here's how that went down with Walton and Wooden telling the story.
I couldn't wait for practice to start. Coach Wooden comes in for inspection. What's this? And he goes, what is this? It's unacceptable. I said, you can't practice today, Bill. I said, come on, Coach, what's going on here?
He told me after his Player of the Year and National Championship team went undefeated, I didn't have the right to tell him he had to wear his hair a little shorter and couldn't wear facial hair. And I say, you're correct, Bill. I don't have that right. I just have the right to determine who's going to play, and we're going to miss you. In about 15 minutes, I'm not going to have you unless you go upstairs and get taken care of right away. He stood and looked at me. Finally, I said, 14 minutes.
I'm out the door. Get on my bike and I ride as hard and as fast as I can. And I race down into Westwood and jump in the barber chair and say, just cut it all off. And give me a plastic razor and a glass of water. And I just rode right in and just dumped my bike right on the side of Pollin Pavilion and went and stood in the back of the line and hoped that he wouldn't notice that I had missed the first 5 minutes of practice.
How about that? He didn't want to miss practice. He loved playing basketball. He finishes UCLA, #1 pick of the NBA draft, of course, goes to the Portland Trail Blazers, and then the injuries are a problem. He plays only 35 games in his rookie year because of problems with his feet. He plays in 51 games in his second year, and people are beginning to wonder about him. This is a period of time where athletes are told to suck it up. And he develops a relationship with a man by the name of Jack Scott, who was a sports activist. And he was known for his concern with exploitation of athletes and race relations in sports, the sociology of sports, his association with the radical sports movement. He was also involved with the Symbionese Liberation Army, which was the Patty Hearst story, which, if you're not familiar with, study up on it. It's one of the great important stories in the history of the 1970s. But anyway, he has this relationship with Walton, and his whole thing is to de-emphasize this sports culture that's created by people like Bear Bryant and Vince Lombardi, that winning is everything. He becomes the athletic director at Oberlin College and has the Oberlin experiment, where he tries to foster inclusion and putting less emphasis on winning. Well, Walton was all about winning. So you got a player who's not playing because of injury, and people don't know how severe the pain is. They just say, oh, yeah, he doesn't want to be out there. And now he's associated with Jack Scott, who's got this idea of, this a little bit too much, this winning is everything. Well, Walton was all about winning. And finally he did in his third year, though he only played 65 games. He led Portland to the NBA championship against a Philadelphia team that wasn't supposed to lose. That was the first year they had Dr. J after the merger of the NBA. They had George McGinnis. They had Darryl Dawkins. They had great players. Doug Collins, who was the #1 pick of the draft, was on that team. And Philly won the first 2 games, but then there was 4 straight for Portland. They won the championship, and it was supposed to be a decade of dominance for them. It wasn't. Walton didn't play. He started out the next year incredibly well. It's part of the book, The Breaks of the Game, by David Halberstam, which is one of the great sports books ever written. But he managed to play only 58 games that year. His team was 50-8 when he went out. And then they collapsed without him. He didn't play the following year because of injury. He wants out of Portland. He goes to San Diego, and over the next 5 years plays a total of 14 games because of injury. Misses all of 80-81, all of 81-82, then plays for the Clippers 32 games in 1982-83. He plays 55 games the following year, 67 the following. Winds up in Boston, 6-man, and that is the greatest year of his career. Even though he's only playing 20 minutes a game, they win the NBA championship, and he loves it. And to his death, he identified himself as a Boston Celtic, even though he only played 90 games for them total. But that 1 year that he was the 6th man in Boston, that's the only year he played 80 games in his career. He played a total of 468. LeBron James has played over 1,400 games, over 1,000 more. So he played less than a third of LeBron's games. But he's still regarded as one of the 50 greatest players of all time. And more importantly, one of the most important people in our culture over the last 50 years. And Scott Van Pelt, who does this as well as anyone, writes for broadcast phenomenally, did his on his show last night, what he does with certain events and certain stories in history like this. He did his one big thing on Bill Walton, and it was phenomenal.
Sometimes the clues are laid out pretty clearly, aren't they? The Conference of Champions said that's a wrap. Celtics are playing a game against a team coached by a member of the '86 title team, and Bill Walton, linked in ways large and small to all of that, has passed away. A box of rain will ease the pain, and love will see you through. In every direction after this gut punch, the love for Walton was a blinding beam of light. I started pondering his life, and it's amazing how many chapters could be their own standalone story. His UCLA days seem like a myth, a fish story. He actually went 21 for 22 in an NCAA final. His reverence for John Wooden was a torch he carried all his days. Walton's NBA tenure was decorated, certainly, multiple rings, a finals MVP, very different tenures in Portland than in Boston. Had his body not broken down, who knows what he might have been, arguably still on the list of best big men of all time. He was undoubtedly on the list of the world's tallest deadheads. Big Red, easily spotted at shows around the world. Rick Carlisle shared the story Monday of Walton getting him tickets to see the Dead not far from us in the old Capitol Center. He sent Carlisle to the back door. Walton told him to ask for Ramrod. Carlisle was far from a deadhead, and he needed a miracle. Walton provided it. Carlisle's date that night is now his wife. The last act many of our younger viewers know and consumed. It was Bill the broadcaster. He was, to speak as he did, an intergalactic force of nature. We had him on once after Oregon and UCLA, and he started talking about bears. Not the cow bears, but actual bears in Banff, British Columbia, I think it was. He was roaring and growling. I just gave up and let him go. Not that I could have stopped him or wanted to. His stream of consciousness that was the soundtrack of the sport was an on-ramp to his passions, his curiosities, the world, the people, the music, the food, the culture, the wildlife, the absolute joy of living his life and doing so with boundless energy and vigor. I admired that so. As I do the stories of his generosity. They're everywhere today. Read about the kindness that he showed Mike Breen and his father. Pay attention to the details of how Walton listened when those who were in awe of simply being in his presence shared their stories with him. He remembered the details because he was interested. You know how rare that is for people who have been the center of everyone else's attention to actually care enough to pay attention to anyone else? Bill did that. He closed his texts with shine on, beam on. He was a spiritual shaman. And while our time runs out because it's finite, the universe is not. And he went on a joyride through its expanse. And now, anywhere there is light, I'll just chalk that up to Bill Walton, bounding through the cosmos. Shine on, big fella. Thank you for your life. What a joy it was that it crossed paths with ours.
That's Scott Van Pelt, and that's about as good as it can be done. That is phenomenal writing, phenomenal delivery, and it's always good to have a good subject to talk about, which Walton is, but that is a great 3-minute summary there, and with great anecdotes about his life. A little more detail on the Mike Breen story. This goes back to when Walton and Breen were working together at NBC. It's got to be over 20 years ago. And Mike Breen's father, who had served in the Navy during World War II and had been on the ship the U.S. Montana, it was docked in San Diego, where Walton, of course, had an off-season home. And so Mike Breen's dad at that point was suffering from Parkinson's, and they wanted to before he became completely disabled, to get him to see the ship. So Breen and his brother arranged that they were going to take the dad on a trip to San Diego and stay in a hotel and see the ship and come home. Well, he called Bill Walton. There are millions of stories out there like this. that Breen called Walton and said, "Do you have any hotel recommendations?" And he said, "Yes, my house. This is where you're going to stay." "Oh, no, I insist. You stay with us." And as Breen tells the story, they were there for 3 days. Walton never left the side of his dad, who he was meeting for the first time. And by the end of the 3 days, he felt like his dad knew Bill Walton better than he did, and he'd done several years of broadcasting with him. Those are stories that they're common everywhere. You're hearing all of them. You're reading them. People who say, "Yeah, I met him for the first time. I asked him if he could give me advice or if he could send me an email," and we would get incredible amounts of advice or merchandise or whatever it was. I mean, he went out of his way to do that. John Feinstein's got a column today about Bill Walton sitting in his seat hours before an NCAA Final Four game, and John was just dropping off his computer. He says, "No, sit." You go, No. This is your seat, John." He goes, No. You're Bill Walton. You take the seat." And then Walton sent him some tie-dye T-shirts or something. I mean, just an encounter that happens of one little thing, and he went out of his way to make sure that he had more than just a handshake or just a smile with somebody. And, you've heard all the stories that Dave Pash tells about them doing games and Walton spending hours afterwards taking pictures and signing autographs as long as anybody wanted him. That's not the guy that we knew early in his career. That's not the guy who was in some ways vilified for being counterculture when he was at UCLA, and because of his stutter, was very shy and talking to the media and didn't like to do it in the early days in Portland. And then he becomes this like a flower that blooms, and literally you can't shut him up. And he talked right up until the end, passing away at the age of 71. We got Mike Callow sitting in for Tony next. I'll be back here tomorrow morning at 9 a.m.